You know, when you look back at history, some years just stand out. They're more than dates, they're turning points. And 1776 was absolutely one of those years. It's when a simple colonial rebellion caught fire and turned into a full-blown revolutionary war for a brand new kind of nation. It was a year of crazy gambles, incredible victories, and of course, a declaration that changed the world. So let's dive into how it all went down.
All right, so let's set the scene. It's autumn, 1775. The Second Continental Congress is meeting down in Philadelphia, and they just know a massive British military strike is coming. It's not a matter of if, but when. Meanwhile, up in Massachusetts, you've got General George Washington, and he has the main British army pretty much trapped in Boston. But his own Continental Army? Well, it's a brand new, fragile, totally untested force. So yeah, the colonies are an open rebellion, but they are a long, long way from being a unified country. And what's happening across the pond? Well, King George III was having none of it. He had zero intention of negotiating. He was completely convinced that one single, powerful strike, what he called a smart blow, would be all it took to crush this rebellion. In his eyes, the Americans were just dangerous and ill-designing men, and he was putting together the largest army Britain had ever sent overseas just to prove his point. The stakes, they just couldn't have been any higher.
So facing this huge threat, Congress decides it can't just sit back and wait to get hit. It's got to go on the offensive. And their target? Canada. The big idea was to launch this preemptive strike, liberate the French Canadians from British rule, and convince them to join the party as a 14th colony. It was, to put it mildly, an incredibly ambitious and kind of desperate gamble.
But here's the thing, there was a massive disconnect between what the Americans were hoping for and the actual reality on the ground in Canada. The Patriots just assumed the French Canadians were miserable under British rule and would greet them with open arms, but they missed one crucial detail. Britain had recently passed something called the Quebec Act, which actually gave French Catholics their religious freedom and legal traditions back. So honestly, most of them had very little interest in joining some American rebellion. The American sales pitch just fell completely flat.
And that political miscalculation was matched by an absolutely brutal physical reality. A second American army, led by a young, super ambitious colonel named Benedict Arnold, decided to take a shortcut through the wilderness of northern Maine. As Arnold himself put it, the march was a total nightmare. We're talking thick forests, freezing rivers, and endless swamps. Way, way worse than anyone imagined. A lot of his men just gave up and headed home. By the time Arnold's exhausted troops finally met up with the main army, their combined force was only about 1,200 men. And they were staring down Quebec, one of the strongest walled cities in all of North America. With a brutal winter setting in and their enlistments about to run out, they decided to risk it all on a desperate attack during a blizzard. It was a complete catastrophe. Their commander, General Montgomery, was killed. Arnold was badly wounded and hundreds of their men were captured. The whole Canadian gamble had failed, spectacularly. But as the terrible news from the north started to spread, an absolutely incredible story of American ingenuity was playing out back in Massachusetts. While the invasion of Canada was a crushing defeat, the siege of Boston, that was about to become the Patriots' first truly inspiring victory.
The hero of this part of the story is a guy named Henry Knox. He's just 25 years old, a bookseller who became a colonel. So Washington's army around Boston had a big problem. They had no heavy cannons. Knox comes up with his totally audacious plan. He says he'll go 300 miles to the captured Fort Ticonderoga, get their massive cannons, and somehow drag them all the way back to Boston, in the dead of winter. And you know what? He actually did it. Using sleds, oxen, and just sheer determination, he hauled 59 heavy guns over frozen mountains and rivers. It was a logistical miracle, truly. Okay, so Washington has the cannons. Now for the really brilliant part. For 2 straight nights, the Americans just bombard Boston, making a ton of noise as a diversion. Then, on the 3rd night, under the cover of all that cannon fire, thousands of his men quietly dragged the heavy guns and pre-built fortifications up to a place called Dorchester Heights. It's a strategic spot that overlooks the entire British fleet in the harbor. When the sun came up, the British generals looked up and were horrified. It was like an entire American fortress had just appeared out of thin air, with cannons aimed right at their ships. The British commander, General Howe, he was completely trapped. He had 2 choices: order a bloody, suicidal uphill attack, or abandon the city. He chose to get out. After a 10-month siege, the entire British Navy sailed away. For the Patriots, this was a massive victory. It sparked celebrations everywhere and gave a huge boost to morale across all the colonies.
That victory was a huge shot in the arm, for sure. But this revolution wasn't just being fought with cannons. An equally ferocious battle was being waged for the hearts and minds of the American colonists themselves, who were, and this is key, deeply and bitterly divided over this whole rebellion.
You know, it's easy for us to think that everyone was a patriot, right? Not even close. It's estimated that about 1 in 5 Americans were loyalists, people who wanted to remain loyal to King George, and their reasons were complicated. Some had strong family or business connections to Britain. Others just really feared that breaking away from the most powerful empire in the world would lead to total chaos, mob rule, and a horrifying civil war.
So, on one side, you have the pure, unfiltered joy of the Patriots. This quote from a newspaper in Connecticut just perfectly captures that feeling after the British were run out of Boston. They saw their troops as gallant heroes and the British as barbarous oppressors.
And then you have the other side. This quote from a British lieutenant shows you the raw anger, the absolute hatred that people loyal to the crown felt. There was no middle ground here. This conflict was literally tearing communities and even families apart. It was neighbor against neighbor, sometimes even father against son. And right into the middle of this firestorm drops a political bombshell. It's a little pamphlet called Common Sense, written by an English radical named Thomas Paine. What made this thing so revolutionary wasn't just its ideas, but its language. See, back then, political writing was all formal and stuffy, meant for the rich elite. Paine wrote in plain, fiery, everyday language that anyone could understand. He basically made fun of the whole idea of a king and made this powerful argument for an independent American republic. They sold something like 100,000 copies. It convinced thousands of ordinary people that the only way forward was to make a clean break with Britain.
So you've got this huge military win in Boston, and you've got this powerful little book, Common Sense, spreading like wildfire. This 1-2 punch is what finally pushed the Continental Congress to take its most radical, most irreversible step yet, declaring independence. So after weeks of intense, secret debates in Philadelphia, the colonies all agreed on one thing. This decision had to be unanimous. A single no vote could have sunk the entire project. On July 2nd, they did it. The vote for independence passed. Then, 2 days later, on July 4th, Congress officially adopted the final written document, which was drafted mostly by Thomas Jefferson, with help from giants like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. The colonies were now officially the United States of America.
I mean, those opening words are just incredible, right? They proclaimed a whole new reason for government to exist, one based on liberty and the rights of the people. But, and this is so important to remember, there were major compromises made to get that unanimous vote. A whole paragraph that Jefferson wrote condemning the slave trade was cut out to keep the southern colonies on board. It was a profound contradiction that would haunt this new nation for decades.
The Declaration was a bold, powerful statement. But a declaration on a piece of paper is one thing. Actually winning a war against the British Empire, that's something else entirely. And while the ink was still drawing in Philadelphia, the empire was getting ready to deliver its overwhelming response. So, in late June, people in New York City started spotting sails on the horizon. Then a few more, and then more and more, until over 120 ships, the first wave of the British invasion, showed up under General Howe. The city just went into a panic. One person wrote, "You can scarcely conceive of the distress and anxiety. The British were back."
And they came in force. We're talking 32,000 professional British and German soldiers all descending on New York. For these guys, it was personal. They were absolutely burning to avenge that humiliating defeat back in Boston and to crush this rebellion for good.
In total, the full invasion fleet had 400 ships with thousands of sailors. All told, the British were bringing almost half of the total military power of their entire global empire and focusing it on this one city. This was a force designed not just to win a battle, but to completely awe an entire continent into giving up. So, it all comes down to this. The United States of America had been declared. A new world, just like Paine had written, was at hand. But as this unimaginable military power gathered just off the coast, the ultimate question still hung in the air. Could a nation that was born of ideals and parchment actually survive its trial by fire?